Thank you for coming and thank you for being here with us tonight. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the center. I think I know most of you. I'm glad to see you again, and if you're here for the first time, a special welcome for coming to the center tonight. We're very happy tonight to have the annual Albert and Vera List Lecture in Jewish Studies. This lecture draws on endowments that go back to the very beginning of the center, but the lecture series itself, dedicated to Jewish Studies, is itself relatively new. The first lecture in the current series, at least, was in 2013. Lewis Newman from Carleton College spoke on "To Forgive is Human, Jewish Reflections on the Meaning and Practice of Forgiveness." And then in 2014, Christina Hayes from Yale University spoke on "Divine Law, a Tale of Two Concepts and Three Responses." We're very happy today to have the third annual List Lecture in Jewish Studies. Professor Joel Kaminsky, Professor of Religion and the Morningstar Family Professor in Jewish Studies at Smith College, will give the lecture. I am not worthy to introduce him properly, and so I went through all my lists and so on and found there's a List Professor here at Harvard University. John Levenson, the Albert A. List Professor of Jewish Studies, will do the honors of introducing our distinguished guest tonight.
Thank you, Professor Clooney. Our lecturer this afternoon, as mentioned, is Professor Joel S. Kaminsky, who is Professor of Religion at Smith College, where he now also holds the Morningstar Family Chair in Jewish Studies. A native of Cleveland, actually University Heights, Professor Kaminsky did his undergraduate studies in Oxford, receiving his bachelor's degree in religion and political science from Miami University in that town in southwestern Ohio. This is not the same as the University of Miami, where we all wish we were this month. He received his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Among the several volumes that he has authored or edited are Corporate Responsibility in the Hebrew Bible, 1995, and Yet I Love Jacob, Reclaiming the Biblical Concept of Election, 2007. The recent Abingdon Introduction to the Bible, Understanding Jewish and Christian Scripture, 2014, of which he is the lead author, has just been named an outstanding title by the American Library Association's Choice magazine. Joel Kaminsky has also served as visiting professor at Duke Divinity School and Yale University, and as visiting fellow in Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religion of the University of Durham in England. This semester, we're fortunate to have him as visiting professor here at Harvard Divinity School. On a personal note, I might add that Joel Kaminsky is one of those rare individuals who are able to be both a scholar and a human being. Among his non-scholarly attributes, he is, or at least was, a deadhead, which he once explained to me refers to a devotee of the Grateful Dead. That must be some kind of music thing. And in graduate school, he did stand-up comedy. Personally, I've always found him to be a stand-up sort of guy. The title of his lecture this afternoon is "Would You Impugn My Justice? A Nuanced Approach to the Hebrew Bible's Theology of Recompense." Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Joel S. Kaminsky.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Professor Levenson for that very generous introduction and to express my gratitude to Professor Clooney and the Center for the Study of World Religions for inviting me to give this year's Albert and Vera List Lecture in Jewish Studies. While daunted at presenting this paper to such an august audience, I'm eager to receive feedback on how I might refine as well as expand upon the ideas I will discuss today. With that said, let me begin. A number of years ago, I attended a Passover Seder at a Reconstructionist Jewish household. Reconstructionist Judaism being an American movement that seeks to reclaim many Jewish traditions by giving them new meanings that are compatible with modernity. After the festive dinner, when the liturgy resumed, I noticed that the host and his family rather abruptly skipped over a short Hebrew excerpt from Psalm 37 in the final paragraph of the Grace After Meals. This short proverb-like snippet is read by many, but as I've come to learn, not all who recite the traditional Jewish grace. In English, the verse states, "I have been young and now am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. Verse 25. Somewhat confused, I inquired why this verse was elided. Paraphrasing the host's reply, he said, since we all know of cases in which poor, righteous people suffer from hunger, what this verse proclaims is clearly not true. Therefore, we should eliminate such affirmations from our prayers. Although I did not respond at the time, it immediately struck me that the host articulated a widespread, but from my view, troubling, contemporary outlook both about the nature of prayer and about the overarching theology of retribution that pervades much of the Tanakh. Now, Reconstructionist Judaism is known for being liturgically innovative, so this change in the prayers and the host's response were not unexpected. Yet the truth is, contemporary biblical scholars have expressed almost identical sentiments about this verse and others in the Bible like it. John Barton, a distinguished expert on biblical ethics, in a recent essay describes the person who authored Psalm 37:25 as, quote, surely someone who should have got out more, suggesting that the psalmist was obviously sheltered and naive about life's difficulties, while implying that such language is theologically trite. Although I have honed in on a certain type of response to the language in Psalm 37 that lay readers might identify as a prayer, most biblical scholars describe Psalm 37 as a wisdom psalm. Unsurprisingly, one can find many analogs to Barton's statement regularly echoed in discussions of books like Proverbs, as well as in reference to the theology of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history, which is a fancy way of referring to the 6 books that are history-like between Joshua and 2 kings that have been edited by the scribes who edited Deuteronomy. It will therefore be useful to begin by exploring and challenging the broader critique leveled by both lay and expert contemporary readers of the Bible against what I'm here going to call the standard biblical view of divine retribution. While I hope to demonstrate that there are many nuances in the standard view of divine retribution, I am using the term to describe the wide array of biblical texts that affirm that God indeed punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. Then, toward the end of this essay, I will explore how one might productively read the prayer language found in Psalm 37. The theological fault line here is the supposedly flat-footed and unrealistic but widespread biblical view of the nexus between one's behavior and one's recompense. Thus, the theology found in Deuteronomy regularly asserts that if Israel is obedient to God, she will be rewarded, and if Israel is disobedient, she will be punished for her sinful behavior. It is less clear that Deuteronomy ever asserts that this means if someone is suffering, they must have committed a sin, or that the righteous would never experience any adversity. Yet many presume that this is indeed what not only Deuteronomy, but also texts like Proverbs and Psalms assert. In turn, when scholars look to the book of Job, they frequently describe Job as a revolutionary book that overturned this standard biblical view of retribution, inasmuch as Job's friends are seen not only as slavishly representing this standard viewpoint, but also as ultimately losing their argument with Job. Notice the way in which the outlooks of books like Proverbs is contrasted with the viewpoint introduced by Job in recent scholarship. We will begin with a quotation from Catherine Dell, she teaches at Cambridge, that illustrates how scholars describe Proverbs as containing a simplistic representation of reality, which was challenged and ultimately exploded by the book of Job. To involve my audience, I will occasionally ask for volunteers to read. So I'm hoping I can convince somebody to read quotation 1 for me. Can I get, yes, thank you.
While Proverbs maintained an optimistic belief in the doctrine of retribution, Job is seen to be a refutation of this. Job represents the experience of the righteous man to whom suffering unexpectedly came. Did this not show that the exhortations to lead a good life in order to expect material rewards found in Proverbs were bankrupt?
Speaking more specifically of the arguments put forward by Job's 3 friends, and later by Elihu, Norman Habel makes the following generalization. In accord with this is quote 2 on your page, in accord with the widespread ancient Near Eastern belief, they contend that the just are rewarded and the wicked are punished, but they also endorse the converse principle, those who are suffering affliction must be sinners who deserve the suffering. Similar notes are sounded in James Crenshaw's discussion of Job. Might somebody read quotation 3 for us? Thank you.
The older simplistic understanding of divine providence hardly reckoned with powerful empires led by deities other than the Lord. Nor did it take sufficiently into account the status of individuals making up the collective whole. The convenient explanation for suffering, that adversity arose as punishment for sin, may have sufficed for a brief interval, but eventually this idea produced a mighty outcry.
Crenshaw goes on to describe the theological outlook of Job's friends as follows. Quote, suffering invariably exposed guilt, and grievous misfortune signified heinous offense, end quote. In a recent popular book on the Bible's place in Western and American culture, more specifically, Timothy Beale, if you look at quote 4, argues that Job provides a direct critique of what he sees as the binary and rigid outlook found in Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history. Quote, keep God's commandments and you and your society and your world will thrive and be blessed. Disobey them and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. The book of Job directly challenges the faith in that moral universe. Beale goes on to say that Job's friends, quote, defend God's moral universe and insist Job must have done something wrong to deserve such misery, end quote. Finally, to demonstrate just how widely this sentiment is shared, one need only turn to Robert Frost's poetic reflection, seen in quote 5, an excerpt from it, in which God at one point tells Job, you realize by now the part you played to stultify the Deuteronomist and change the tenor of religious thought. There is little doubt that various recent mind-numbing tragedies have affected how books like Job are understood and read in relation to other books in the Bible. The Shoah and other contemporary monstrous evils, either inflicted by humans upon other humans or inflicted by nature upon hapless humans, have led to a growing sense that one must reject the central biblical idea that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. To do otherwise, so the argument goes, only further victimizes the victims of such tragedies by implying that their suffering is a punishment for their misdeeds. I would suggest that this shift in our thinking has become so pervasive that we are no longer capable of reading Job as a real argument between two equally compelling viewpoints. Rather, Job's friends are seen as engaging in pietistic and somewhat hollow attempts to uphold the standard view, while Job's own views are embraced by contemporary readers with little, if any, reserve. The difficulty of maintaining the portrait I've just drawn is that it does a huge injustice to the nuances of the Bible's various theologies of divine justice, and it in turn makes the dialogues in the book of Job much less interesting than they in fact are if one sees the merits and weaknesses in both sides of the argument. Let me begin my response to this dismissive portrayal of key aspects of the Bible's understanding of the divine economy by noting a number of nuances found within texts like Deuteronomy and Proverbs that suggest the Bible's more standard views on God's management of the world are quite a bit more complex than commonly asserted. Even in texts like Deuteronomy, adversity is not always seen as a punishment. In fact, at times, adversity functions as a form of training or instruction. For example, in quote 6, Deuteronomy 8:2-5 puts forward a rather innovative understanding of Israel's long wilderness sojourn and the many deprivations it involved, one that is quite different from the assertion in Numbers that this was simply a punishment. I wonder if I might get a brave soul to read quotation 6 for us. Thank you.
Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The clothes on your back did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you.
Thank you. And I will note that you are an excellent reader, because every time, other times I've had this lecture delivered where somebody read that quote, they always got tripped up on the with which. It's a little unusual construction. In this passage, we hear rather explicitly about God humbling, testing, and disciplining Israel in a manner that suggests one cannot simply assume every difficulty one experiences in life is a punishment for some previous sin. It is worth noting that Deuteronomy as a whole, and chapter 15 in particular, underlie the importance of being generous to the poor and marginalized in Israelite society. Now, if one's current situation was simply a reflection of what one deserved, then these injunctions make no sense. Why help a poor person when helping them would interfere with God's punishment of them? Clearly, the authors of Deuteronomy think one should help a poor person because they have a moral claim on us and they deserve to be helped. In short, Deuteronomy recognizes that one can be poor and righteous, an idea widely attested in Psalms and Proverbs as well. Like Deuteronomy, Proverbs also affirms the notion that the righteous may be chastised and receive discipline not because they are wicked, but precisely to avoid becoming one of the wicked, that is, one who does not know how to interpret and properly respond to the various types of adversities many will inevitably experience. In fact, these nuances in the Tanakh's understanding of human suffering are also affirmed in the central narrative of the Torah. It's hard to think of any biblical text that ever explicitly links Israel's 400 years of exile, affliction, and eventual enslavement in Egypt to some sin on Israel's part, indicating that biblical authors always had acknowledged that certain instances of great adversity and suffering may have nothing to do with punishment or even chastisement. Note the rationale in Genesis 15 for Israel's lengthy enslavement in Egypt is that it would take that long for the sins of the Canaanites to accumulate to the point where God would drive them from the Holy Land. Exodus itself provides no real rationale for Israel's intense suffering and the near genocide she experienced, aside from mentioning that at some point the cries of the Israelites finally stirred God to remember his promises to the patriarchs. Israel's extended exile and enslavement in Egypt provides a natural segue to examine another wrinkle in the standard view's understanding of God's justice and the human experience of evil. Within both Proverbs and Psalms, one finds a prominent and very interesting nuance surrounding both the exactness of the timing in which God's justice, both the exactness and the timing in which God's justice prevails in the world. Psalm 9:18 is instructive on this point. Quote, "For the needy shall not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the poor perish forever." End quote. This verse has many analogs throughout Psalms and Proverbs. In fact, a host of lament psalms are based around the notion that the person suffering may be suffering even though he's righteous. To provide an example, might someone volunteer to read quotation 7, an excerpt drawn from Psalm 10? Thank you.
Sure. For the wicked boast of the desires of their heart. Those greedy for gain curse and renounce the Lord. Their ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of their sight. As for their foes, they scoff at them. They sit in ambush in the villages. In hiding places, they murder the innocent. Their eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. They lurk in secret like a lion in its covert. They lurk that they may seize the poor. They seize the poor and drag them off in their net. They stoop, they crouch, and the helpless fall by their might.
Note how the author of this psalm not only recognizes that righteous people may suffer, but states at times they might even be murdered, a sentiment also found in Psalm 94:6. The inverse is also openly acknowledged, that the wicked may indeed prosper for a time. Martin Luther King Jr., who was loosely paraphrasing Theodore Parker, summed up this element of the standard biblical view of God's justice when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Furthermore, it recognizes that some who did suffer may not personally live to see the punishment of the wicked. Well, this very question deserves attention and is taken up by Job himself at length, and is in fact taken up by Job himself at length in Job 21. It is important to realize that those who asserted that God's justice would in the end become manifest were not ignorant of the fact that for a time the wicked might prevail, and that during such intervals some innocent people might suffer in a manner never fully requited. This should lead us to suspect that scholars like John Barton, who think the author of Psalm 37 really needed to get out more often, may be interpreting the text in a wooden and not particularly helpful manner. If I am correct that the biblical authors and their audience rarely, if ever, naively assume that the righteous never suffered, then this may help us regain a more balanced reading of Job and of the larger biblical discussion surrounding divine retribution. A number of the complexities I have highlighted within what I am calling the standard biblical view of God's justice are asserted by Job's friends, a point acknowledged by both Hebel and Crenshaw. Yet, while scholars like Crenshaw recognize the existence of these nuances, they are often depicted as late, last-ditch efforts to shore up a belief in, quote, a rational deity who was enslaved by a greater principle, justice, end quote. In fact, when one examines the arguments made by Job's friends in detail, one sees they are more subtle and compelling than many critics suggest. Here it is important to point out that the speeches in Job progress over the course of the book, but for nearly 20 chapters, Job's friends do not describe him as a wicked person. Rather, they see him as a normal human being who is experiencing a tribulation and who may indeed be classed among the righteous depending on how he reacts to the situation. His friends initially see Job's suffering as part of a common pattern of someone who will be vindicated in the end, as seen in quotation 8. Might I get somebody to read quote 8 for us? Oh, sure, go ahead.
How happy is the one whom God reproves, therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he binds up. He strikes, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7 no harm shall touch you. In famine he will redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword.
This passage from Job 5 makes clear that Job's current state of suffering is not proof that he is wicked. Both the wicked and righteous experience tribulations. The difference is that the righteous time and again come through such trials. One finds a similar but slightly different point made in Job 11:13 through 20, which I have included as quote 9. Could I impose on somebody to read quotation 9? Any takers? Sure.
If you direct your heart rightly, you will stretch out your hands towards him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and do not let wickedness reside in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure, and you will not fear. You will forget your misery. You will remember it as waters that have passed away. And your life will be brighter than the noonday. Its darkness will be like the morning, and you will have confidence because there is hope. You will be protected and take your rest in safety. You will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. Many will entreat your favor, but the eyes of the wicked will fail. All way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last.
In this passage, Zophar tells Job to pray to God and to keep clear of sinning, if he has indeed engaged in any such behavior in the past. Zophar is not here viewing Job as a wicked person, but rather as someone who in the course of events may have sinned. Well, we happen to know that Job is not suffering because of any sin he committed. There is no way for Zophar to know what we know. Rather, he assumes that Job, like other normal people, may on occasion slip up. In any case, Zophar thinks that by praying to God and ceasing any sinful behavior, Job will again prosper in the future. He also indicates that Job's current tribulation does not make him a wicked person. One sees a similar argument offered by Bildad in chapter 8, where his call that Job seek out God is based around the idea that God will respond to Job's pleas because he may be a righteous individual worthy of restoration. Quote, If you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore you to your rightful place. Even when Bildad considers whether the fate of Job's children was due to their sins, the linkage is phrased only as a possibility, not as a certainty. Quote, if your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. End quote. Elihu, a fourth interlocutor, whose somewhat distinct argument appears to have been added at a later editorial stage, vividly depicts the onset of a severe health challenge and near-death experience in Job 33. He explores how one who recovers from such a harrowing experience may come to view it in a purgatorial fashion. Elihu quotes this person as admitting that his sinful behavior may have played a sinful role in his own suffering, yet while intimating that there may be a connection between general human sinfulness and the various travails we experience, this passage never suggests that a person who goes through such tribulations is in fact a wicked person. Although he may be someone who sinned, both the angelic mediator and God speak of restoring such an individual precisely because he is on balance upright and righteous. We don't have to read it, but I've included it as quote number 10. You can sort of see it there. While some may be uncomfortable at the thought of linking a health crisis to one's moral state, this occurs quite regularly with many who are ill even today. That such a posture can at times go too far and lead to further victimizing one who is suffering does not mean that we should never conduct a self-inventory when disaster strikes. Although it is not always the case, in some instances, patients will admit that the way they lived or took care of themselves in the past contributed to the onset of their health crisis. And it is not uncommon for someone who recovers from a severe illness to commit to living in a more meaningful and healthful fashion in the future, itself implying that they had fallen short. I acknowledge that as the dialogue proceeds and becomes more heated, and as Job's indictments of God's justice grow more vituperative, his friends in turn reach a point where they start accusing him of being obstinate and thereby classing himself among the wicked, that is, those who are unwilling to recognize their shortcomings and repent. Yet even in chapter 22, where this tendency is perhaps most pronounced, Eliphaz does not see Job as so wicked that he's beyond redemption. The chapter ends with a call for Job to repent before it is too late. In any case, my point in this essay is not that the friends were right and Job was mistaken, nor do I wish to suggest there are no problems with the standard view of God's justice that the friends are articulating. Rather, I'm trying to show that the friends have a more sophisticated argument than often acknowledged, and that similar subtleties are found in many other reflections on divine retributions throughout the Hebrew Bible. Our inability to hear these nuances and take them seriously impedes our ability to understand fully the argument within Job, and it also, at times, prevents us from recognizing that the Bible's standard account of God's justice captures truths we still affirm today. With these thoughts in mind, I'd like to turn to another prominent theme emphasized by Job's friends, touched upon in our earlier discussion of Proverbs and Psalms. This is the assertion that the wicked are punished. In the quotation from Job 11 cited earlier, Zophar concludes his soliloquy with a proclamation that while Job has an opportunity to be restored to his previous state, the wicked have no hope. Although the book of Job is commonly understood as a meditation on the question of why bad things happen to good people, much of Job is about why the wicked not only at times escape punishment, but frequently appear to prosper. Many interpreters of Job see the friends as applying a, quote, mechanical application of the dogma of divine retribution, end quote, that assumes, quote, that the prosperous are righteous and the suffering are wicked, end quote. However, this view implies that the friends must be rather sheltered or thick-headed, both of which are unlikely. Carol Newsom, in an important book on Job, makes the following insightful observation about the claim regularly made by Job's dialogue partners and by other texts like Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Proverbs that affirm not only that the righteous are rewarded, but that the wicked are indeed punished. Can I get somebody to read that last quote?
Yet if such statements were intended as universal, exceptionless claims only a deluded fool could believe them. And whatever the friends may be, they are not fools. In some sense, their stories rang true for many people, though they too knew that these were not exceptionless descriptions of events.
Thank you. Newsom correctly describes the book of Job as a contest of moral imaginations, which is the subtitle of her work. Thus, she, more than most other contemporary interpreters, has helped us hear the friends' arguments more sympathetically in their ancient Near Eastern context. I think she is less adept at seeing how the standard view of divine retribution found in Deuteronomy, Psalms, Proverbs, and articulated by Job's friends still carries much weight even today. For although contemporary readers frequently have great difficulty sympathizing with the arguments made by Job's friends when they read the book, many of these same contemporary readers actually affirm a nuanced belief that the righteous are ultimately rewarded and the wicked ultimately punished, a belief not that different from the standard biblical view of divine retribution when it's understood in its full complexity. Peter Berger, in his Rumor of Angels, relates several powerful and pertinent examples that suggest that the affirmation of an overall order and justice in the world is not simply a primitive wish fantasy of a few last holdouts who have not yet surrendered to secular modernity. Rather, despite protestations to the contrary, such views are widely held in the so-called secular West. The first scenario Berger draws is of a mother who reassures her child who may have awoken from a frightful nightmare not to be afraid because everything is all right. Berger asks whether we want to assert that the mother is actually lying, albeit out of love, to shield the child from the terror of death and meaninglessness, or whether the mother is rather making an affirmation of cosmic proportions about the larger world having a meaning and an order that transcends even our own eventual death. If we are not simply lying to our own children, this implies that in spite of the reality of evil and chaos in the world, we affirm at the deepest level that the world is actually shaped in a way that makes ultimate sense. Not just scientific sense, but moral sense. The other particularly poignant example is Berger's discussion of our unconditional condemnation of certain monstrous human atrocities like those committed by the Nazis. The examples Berger gives are in tune with the Bible's view that the world is ordered, and those who engage in truly inhuman and immoral actions call forth from us an impulse to affirm not just that such individuals ultimately will be punished, but that they have cut themselves off from the human community and God. That is, they are damned in the full religious meaning of the word. When talking about the standard view of reward and retribution, it is worth noting that even the most secular parents today tend to tell their children that good behavior eventually will be rewarded and bad behavior brings in its wake negative consequences, although such recompense may take time to become manifest. Furthermore, many of our most culturally resonant films and books continue to affirm this standard model of reward and retribution, even though we are aware that stories like Job's and historical experiences like the Holocaust challenge the notion that the world is indeed ordered and just. The fact that in the face of certain events and experiences, it becomes difficult to affirm the standard view does not mean that the standard view of divine recompense never holds true, or that it has no ability to describe the world in which we live. Interestingly, contemporary readers who claim that Job has once and for all falsified the standard biblical view of divine retribution tend to overlook the shape of the complete book of Job, which concludes with Job's restoration, itself an affirmation of the standard view. While many today find the ending of Job unsatisfying because it seems untrue to experience, it actually captures the real-life trajectory of certain survivors of the Shoah, survivors who lost everything and then live lives filled with new blessings that sit quite uneasily with their experiences during the Holocaust. This is not to say that events like the Shoah pose no challenge to the standard view, but it is to highlight that even disturbing events, which one would think could never be fitted into the standard view, may at times or in part also bear witness to the continuing truth that the righteous eventually will be rewarded and the wicked will indeed be punished. Now let us return to the question of how we should understand the verse from Psalm 37 with which we began, or for that matter, the language of blessing and curse in Deuteronomy. I would contend that perhaps the single largest impediment to understanding the Bible today is our inability to grasp the metaphoric nature of religious language. Carol Newsom draws a sympathetic view of the arguments articulated by Job's friends by paying close attention to the way these friends use metaphors to tell a larger compelling story about the shape of the world. Yet scholars have been slow to recognize and take full account of the metaphorical register of much of the biblical language surrounding divine retribution. On this note, I'll mention that I happened to read the Dick Clifford Festschrift article that Professor Levenson wrote on the ending of Psalm 137, which has very disturbing language exploring its metaphoric structure that is worth a look at. Plug for your essay there. I suspect that this tendency may in part flow from a larger contemporary cultural bias toward authenticity and against set ritual. Thus, I am inclined to agree with the analysis put forward in the recently collaboratively produced book, Ritual and Its Consequences, that we are currently at a cultural moment in the modern West in which the notion of sincerity reigns supreme. The result is that when readers encounter statements like, "I have been young and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread," they tend to react by saying, "This is obviously not true and therefore should not be part of the liturgy." Well, not the sole reason for the spate of liturgical innovation, our inability to pray things that do not reflect our inner emotions or the shape of the outer world at any given time is certainly a prominent factor in the drive to create personalized rituals and prayers with which we are comfortable. The difficulty is that much in religion, most particularly its ritual and liturgical aspects, are not sincere statements of how reality is currently experienced. Rather, rituals and liturgical prayers have a strong subjunctive dimension that expresses how reality at its deepest level should be. Religious language and religiously imbued actions tend to highlight the gap between reality as we often experience it and reality as we religiously affirm it should and ultimately will be. In short, the grammar of religious language and action cannot be understood properly in a world that only tolerates totally sincere expressions of how life is experienced. Now, the truth is, when the standard model of God's justice affirms that the good will be rewarded and the wicked punished, it is spoken as both an affirmation and a prayer. Yet it is not simply a fanciful wish, inasmuch as this type of religious orientation shapes the world we inhabit through various prayers, rituals, and understandings of how the world should indeed work when it is fully under God's reign. While such statements uttered in the wrong circumstances can seem tone-deaf, it is equally tone-deaf to read ancient Israel's religious and prayer language in a wooden fashion that overlooks its subjunctive and prayerful quality. Few today would castigate someone who told his children that, quote, "the truth will prevail," or that, quote, "a just cause will in time be vindicated," end quote. This is because, like ancient Israel, even though we acknowledge the gap between our reality and these words we utter, such expressions are not fanciful platitudes, but affirmations of realities we glimpse and that we work and pray to bring fully into being. Thank you.
Will you entertain questions?
Sure.
Will you answer them? Take your own questions.
Okay. Yes.
I was thinking of a certain Talmudic passage as you were speaking. I think it's in Ketubot, where it says that there's a rabbi named Resh Lakish, and he hears that someone's child has died. And he sends his Meturgeman, or his spokesperson, his translator, his messenger. He was busy. He sent him to pay a shiva call or visit the person to bring condolences to the person. So Resh Lakish's Meturgeman comes to the family in mourning and says,
woe to our generation, because of the terrible evil things they do, their children die. So then the Talmud says, like he comes to comfort him, and he winds up causing him sorrow? What is this? All of a sudden, the Talmud diverts as if non sequitur and says, everyone knows, I mean, not entirely non sequitur, but it says, everyone knows why a bride goes under the bridal canopy and what's going to happen, but anyone who says it out loud is, how do you say minuval, is a scoundrel or is saying terrible things. Now, what's interesting, I mean, if you do academic Talmud and you're going to break it apart and say there was an editor and you look for the mother sugya, the mother source of that statement about the bride, something very cool happens. You go to the source of where it is in flow, and you find 2 pages about illnesses, which illnesses can be traced to actions that people did and their punishments, and which illnesses happen just because they happen. And there's a whole argument there and an attempt to say these sufferings could be for punishment, these just happen, these this, and the whole discussion. So it seems to be that the editor couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle somebody blatantly saying, oh, you suffered because. And it was a way of making the reader go over there so that he or she could see a more nuanced view. So it reminded me of that, and it continues to be not clear. There's different opinions throughout the rabbinic literature and to this.
Well, and look, in our own culture, whatever. I mean, they had the study released recently where they said 80% of cancers are chance, but that means 20% are not, meaning like you may have contributed to them. So we're having this own debate in our culture about what sorts of things, may be due to human causes, what are less understandable, that kind of thing. So, yes, Peter.
How would you translate then the verse from Psalm 37 in the light of what you've said?
Well, I think he is saying it, but I think if you went back in a time machine and you interviewed the guy and you said, do you literally mean that you've never seen this circumstance? I have trouble believing he would say, I literally mean that this has never occurred. Like, I've never heard of anyone being in warfare I don't think he's sort of saying it as an exceptionless claim. He's saying it as, this is the general shape of the world, of how I believe the world is set up. But it doesn't mean that in every instance the world functions like this. So I'm saying he's saying that, but he's saying it as, like Carol Newsom says, not as an exceptionless claim.
But you've been given the task of producing a new edition of
well, I didn't come prepared for that. But I will think about it, and I'll see if I can come up with a good way to get that subjunctive dimension in there. I would just hope to put a footnote down below, say take this subjunctively. But I mean, it's a good question. But
No, I understand. Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Schwartz.
I'm really struck by this Frost quote about the Deuteronomist. I'm thinking about, especially Deuteronomy chapter 4 and chapter 30, some of the really rich theological chapters, widely regarded as being exilic, and they're so, like I said, rich and uplifting, and yet at the same time, in terms of the sort of wisdom influenced understanding that Deuteronomy has of reward and punishment, and also the effort that it seems to go through in its like radically monotheistic agenda to kind of censor certain parts of Israelite religion. There's a sense in which for all of the kind of theological richness of Deuteronomy, it's guilty of a kind of masking of a lot of a different kind of theological richness from the past biblical tradition. And to what extent, in terms of what you've been talking about, and perhaps more broadly, do you think that this kind of like Deuteronomistic theology, which has been so influential on both Judaism and Christianity, to what extent is that something that perhaps needs to be overcome in order to really grapple with other theological voices in the Bible?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd answer that in two ways. I think, sure, absolutely, Deuteronomy has a particular agenda, and it, and it runs roughshod over other things that we might need to hear in other parts of Scripture. But I also think that there's a characterization of Deuteronomy that is not accurate. And you see people writing, like Nathan MacDonald. I mean, there's been a lot of recent scholars who are saying, just because there's this standard, Robert Frost was reading like a lot of the standard line of Deuteronomy has this very flat-footed theology. And I'm not saying there are no elements that are problematic in Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy is not nearly as flat-footed as it's portrayed in a lot of popular scholarship. So that's really my larger answer. But I don't have any problem recognizing that each of the theological streams in Israelite religion is doing inevitably when, a particular theological stream is going to do certain things really well and other things it's not going to do so well because that's the nature of the way that theological discourse is put together. It might be really good at grappling. And again, it's a particular kind of rhetoric to empower obedience. And a lot of, I think, what people hear is the other side of it, which is, oh my God, if you're in a pit, you dug it. That sort of proverb, he who digs a pit, will fall into it. It doesn't mean everyone who's in a pit, right? Take the Joseph story. Would most biblical readers say, well, Joseph is in a pit, he must have dug it, because it says so in Proverbs. So I don't think that you can deduce the opposite from that. I think there's a lot more flexibility in Deuteronomy than has been recognized, and there's a tendency to read the whole thing in an evolutionary line, and some of it stems from great scholars like Crenshaw, but I think James Crenshaw has a very linear way of sort of saying this was proverbial wisdom and it functioned in this particularly, coarse way that was very rigid and unimaginative. And then over time, there was a rebellion against this that we see in Job and Kohelet. And I just think he's over-reading Job and under-reading these other sources. And they have a lot more flexibility in them and a lot more nuance. And I think we have to return and sort of see more of that nuance. That's the way, what I'm looking at trying to do. So, yes?
I have a question, and I'll have to humor me because I'm a sociology student, and this may sound either horribly naive or just completely out of left field. But
She did pass through my intro to the Bible class at Smith, though. So she may be very misinformed.
you still talk to me, though. So much of what you're saying resonates with arguments in my own discipline of sociology, where some sociologists claim that certain models of the world are not faithful descriptions of each detail in it. And some people in sociology might accuse, say, economists of having these crude models of rational choice when in fact human beings are not rational actors. They don't always act rationally. This can't be true. People don't get out enough if you don't know that we're not always calculating costs and benefits in our head. And economists would respond saying, no, but this is simply a model that on the whole lets us understand a broad relationship between two things, say action and retribution. So I was wondering if perhaps there's a parallel in what you're saying, which is that the text is stating, on the whole, there's a model that documents a general represents a general relationship between things. It's not a faithful description of each instance.
I think there is some element of what you're describing, but I also think that these are prayer and religious texts, so by the very statement of it, they're attempting to not only describe the world in this way, which they think often holds but not always holds, but they're attempting to move it in that direction. So there is, a little bit more, something more powerful than what you're describing. The Economist, No. But I think part of what you're saying would hold true, but I just think in religious language you have this other piece where people are saying, yes, it doesn't always hold true, but we believe if we say it powerfully enough and we work to make the world like this, it will start to refract this reality.
Yeah, definitely that should be added. I guess it sounds like some of the scholarly disagreement is about whether these statements are representations and maybe aspirations, or whether they're faithful descriptions.
Right. I think some of it's just for misunderstanding ritual. There are great rituals, like Jonathan Z. Smith, a great scholar from University of Chicago, has often said that early anthropologists said that rituals were rituals reflected the world. He says no. Oftentimes they're like an ideal of like how the hunt should go, but it's nothing like that in the actual hunt. And it's sort of a way of pointing out the gap between the reality that we wish was there and the reality that we inhabit. But I think when a lot of people hear these in everyday context, when they walk into church and they hear this, they're horrified because they're like, oh my God, that's not at all what the world's like. And I don't think that people who said these statements, think about in the Hebrew Bible you have these royal psalms about the enthronement of the Davidic king. This was like a backwater, like Guatemala. This was not the Babylonian Empire, but when you read the language, it has this like imperial, grandiose things about the status of, so obviously there's a huge gap between like the ancient Israelites who are saying this. I mean, it would be different if those things were said in the courts of Assyria. It would more closely reflect that. But in ancient Israel, it's kind of like a joke in certain ways when you're looking at these texts that are describing this cosmic reality of this king and this backwater kingdom as like in charge of the whole world, and God's given him dominion over the whole. So I think these texts do point to this differential. Historically, they point to it.
Thanks for coming and speaking. I was so excited to get here. Every time I hear about folks that wandered for 4 years, I'm always thinking about the children that were born during the period of wandering and the children that came after. Probably because I'm from Chicago and my family has roots in Mississippi. I'm this grandchild of cotton pickers and a descendant of slaves and sharecroppers. So I'm always thinking about how cultures allow or enable suffering to speak. And so I'm wondering, do suffering and hardship ever run out of lessons for us?
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question, but I think religion is in the business of, I think when it's done poorly, when theology is done in non-supple ways, when it's done very flat-footedly, it ends up not describing suffering in a way that's helpful to those who have suffered or to the people who come afterwards. But that doesn't mean that there are not sophisticated models that can empower people, that can derive meaning from suffering. And I know that there's a lot of people today who think that it's more difficult to just throw your hands up and say suffering is meaningless. But I actually think it's more difficult to find sophisticated meaning in suffering. But that's just my view, and I'm somebody who's favorable toward religion, and I think good religion does that well. But I agree, there are pieces of bad religion, and some of those are even in the Bible, and some of those are occasionally in the friends of Job's mouth. So I'm not saying that there is nothing in there that they say that it might be problematic. So, and also some things are less problematic in an intellectual argument than they are in an argument in front of somebody who just experienced a tragedy. So those are two different forums, right? One is like in a philosophy journal or something, and the other is like in a hospital bed. So I think you have to recognize the context of things. I mean, the Job thing is complicated because in some sense it starts out at the hospital bed, but it ends up in a philosophical argument. So sometimes we're offended by the forwardness of the friends, but it is an argument.
I like this idea of the subjunctive role of ritual, flat-footed reading when it comes to missing that subjunctive and making it simply negative. I wonder if another angle might be that books like Deuteronomy and Proverbs is a strong rhetorical function. In other words, Deuteronomy is casting
training you up.
Or Moses is trying to reduce people to enter into it, to hold the covenant. In Proverbs, the speaking voices are trying to reduce people to pursue wisdom around
They're training you,
knowledge.
yeah.
So, at which point you're not going to mention the exceptions that might not work out. You're going to want to mention the cases where it does work.
Right, and that's a little bit, so I have this in my Bible classes, which is when I have, in my intro to the Bible, I have students come in and they learn things about the Bible that they didn't learn in church. And a lot of them get initially very upset, and they're like, not me, but they're like, why didn't they tell me this? And I'm like, their role wasn't to tell you about all the problems. They couldn't do that as an 8-year-old when you were in catechism class. And that wasn't really their role. Their role was to bond you to the tradition. My role is now to complicate that bond. So I agree with you that there's a part of religious upbringing that is doing this shaping, and it's going to elide some of these complexities. I think that's true. I think we got one from Frank.
I'm an inveterate comparativist and can't not do comparative work. This semester I'm teaching the Bhagavad Gita, which is a great religious classic of a different tradition. And I'm thinking of an alternative way of thinking about, so the psalm and the older person who says, everything has gone well, nothing has ever gone wrong. Is that part of what life might teach? And I'm thinking chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, saying that over life you begin to realize the things that could be taken from you don't really matter. The things that others could do to you are not the real evil. And you end up being this person, it's not simply utter detachment, but your standards keep changing over time. So that all the things you thought were important when you were young and all the things you thought were awful when you were young, those things don't matter. So the older wise person says, it's all been wonderful, everything has gone well, not in a literal historical sense, but rather because my values have shifted so much over time. The other way I put it is, I'm thinking, if the book of Job was a Hindu text, you'd have this long discussion, you'd have the theophany at the end, and then it wouldn't be that Job would get back his family and wealth and houses and so on. It would suddenly say, as I am is enough. I have seen the face of God and lived. It's enough. And I don't need any of those things I thought were so wonderful and important early on. Does this just seem odd to you?
There could be a slight element, but it's not Israelite. In other words, but what there is, and something Professor Levenson's talked a lot about in his work, of course, another piece of it is that in ancient Israel, it was not just about the individual. So it was about the cultural persistence of the whole people. So a particular individual might not, everything might not be worked out for them perfectly, but the question is, over this long arc of time, is God's relationship to the people of Israel manifesting in this way that is talked about? And the tradition says, yes, it is. But I don't know that that's pretty non-Israelite, but but certainly there are pieces of the Friends' argument when they say just because you're down doesn't mean that you might not be more up later on. You're just going to have to wait and see. And that this is a God wounds, but he binds up. And you've gone through 6 travails, but the righteous person keeps coming back up. So there is that sense. But I don't know about like the. It's still important, and that's why. Today, people might look at the ending of Job and say, well, that's pretty weak. That's kind of like this artificial ending on there. But I don't think the ancient Israelites thought about it like that. It's a little bit like saying, well, that resurrection scene in the New Testament, that's ruined the whole story. We should just recognize Jesus was dead and, whatever. He said important things. The resurrection thing is not an irrelevant point to that story.
I just add, I think you're perfectly right on that what I was just saying has much more to do with an individual's making peace with life, and not so much a sense of the community, except in the sense that a text like the Gita is instructive of a culture, but that for the individual. So the ironic thing at the end of the Gita, Arjuna, the warrior, suddenly realizes none of this really matters, goes out and there's a terrible war and everybody gets killed.
But it still doesn't matter.
and it doesn't matter.
Right.
And that's just, it just strikes me as an interestingly different logic that plays off some of the very themes that you're talking
Yeah, I'll be curious to talk to you over dinner, because I do a lot of work on violence in the Bible, and be interested in, there are, of course, people who argue that the Gita is promoting violence by,
Right,
you know,
right, yeah.
I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about that, but we'll talk over dinner.
Yes, just on this point, that there is an interesting Jewish tradition, specifically with regard to Job's response at the end, where he says, "Em as nichanti al ha'efa,"
Yeah.
which can be understood as either I repent
Yeah. in
dust and ashes, or I am finally comforted here in the dust and ashes. And so the Metzudat David, for example, sees this is actually what he's saying. He's saying God's response actually finally brought him comfort. And so that could be something similar, where he, as an individual, somehow come to that, even apart from the restoration that you have at the end. So that.
Right, there's space for that, but I just think it's probably an over-reading of the whole. I'm just saying, first of all, you're very individualizing the tradition, like it's advice to an individual. I think reading it like in the Gita sense of, you know, here is advice to you as an individual to overcome your possessions and see. I'm not saying there's none of that in there, but it seems it's not great. I have trouble seeing it. Yes.
I can't help but think of my Baba and my grandmother lived through the Holocaust, and she and my grandfather both had very different Jewish perspectives afterwards, and I want to just focus on my grandmother's. She lost all her family. She saw horrific things, but all she would say is the miracles that happened. She would say, "Oh, you know, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God appeared and made the train do this, and God saved this." She was constantly talking about the miracles, and God was incredible, and the miracles. And those miracles that happened to her, miracles she saw around her. But whenever my father tried to give a little sermon or homily at the Shabbat table, she would interrupt him and say, "Aha, yes, but why 6 million had to die? Why? Every Shabbos we couldn't get, so why?" My father doesn't have an answer, because that's the people. That she had to know, she had to understand. But when she was talking about things that happened, she would never talk about the bad things. Miracles, God's miracles. But that was sort of meta, it was the people. And that every Shabbat she would want my father to answer.
Right. I mean, you see this commonly when there's like a train wreck or something, and somebody's like, I lived through it and it was God's action. Of course, nobody says, well, did God cause the train wreck? You know, or where was God before the train wreck? So I'm just saying, you hear these responses.
The positive was where she saw God. She wouldn't give him the negative.
Any questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.